Thank you all for allowing me to be at Sana and Daba. As you can see, I'm not necessarily in the kind of shape that I would have assumed would be advantageous for this experience. But again, I appreciate your patience and certainly the cooperation and support of everyone from the Chief Rabbi's office and all others who have been engaged with us in this have made this as easy as it could possibly be. And I look forward to perhaps being able to be with you on other occasions when I don't necessarily need to be talking from a hospital bed. This particular session, I had initially called it Raising Sexually Healthy Children, and people at Sandai and Daba thought it best to be calling it Raising a Moral Child in a Promiscuous World. So we'll see if we can deal with both of those things, and both of them I think will be challenging, and I look forward to being able to giving you some sense of direction and how to cope with this very complex situation. Let me start off with a situation that we became aware of not too long ago. It seems that a family who are neighbors of our children have 4 children, the oldest of whom being a 15-year-old young man, and she fell pregnant, and they decided that it was time for them to tell their children. So she and her husband sat down with their 15-year-old son and said to him that he was about to have another sibling, and he said to them, after thinking about it for a moment, "I know what you did, and it's disgusting." Well, I think that really sort of gives sufficient reason for us to be able to confront this entire aspect of human interaction, and in fact is how do we raise sexually healthy children? I'd like to start off by asking you to participate in a very brief survey. Now, generally, I would be able to see what the results of this survey might be, but you're going to have to look around yourselves, and I hope I'll be able to help you draw some conclusions. My first question to you is follows. Raise your hands if, when you were growing up as a child or as an adolescent, you had an open sexual conversation with your parents. Now, take a look around you, see how many of you put up your hands. If I'm not mistaken, very, very few. And I will tell you that occasionally when I appear at sex therapy conventions and ask the same question, even among people who are sex therapists, I get very few people who respond and who say, yes, they in fact did have such a conversation with their parents. And my second question is to you, and how many of you as parents had any kind of open sexual conversation with your children? I would assume that very few more, in fact, did have that. So we're going to be talking about that today, and my theme is going to be not so much as this cartoon seems to indicate today, sex education in a context of a school environment, but rather what should be happening within a home. And here's an initial study that you might want to take a look at. A major study showed that adolescents who reported feeling connected to parents and family were more likely than other teens to delay initiating sexual intercourse. In a subsequent study, in another survey, only 38% of young women and 25% of young men said that they had ever gotten a good idea from their parents that helped them talk about sexual issues with their girlfriends or boyfriends. And part of the problem is that even when parents do make an attempt to have this kind of conversation with their children, it tends to be what's called a top-down kind of communication, meaning we are going to tell you, we the parents, what you the children, what we think you need to know. There is very little attempt to listen to kids, to engage them, to find out what's worrisome with regard to their conceptualizations about sexuality and relationships. All we give them really is our parents' perspective. And the question is, why is that? Why is it so difficult for us as parents to be able to talk with our children about a topic which is so fundamental to our children's development and so much a part of everyone's lives? Let me tell you something about an interesting quotation that someone sent me a number of years ago. You know, one of the great Talmudic lights of the previous generation was the Chafetz Chaim, who was considered to be the elucidator of Jewish law par excellence. And his son wrote a book, and in the book he wrote that when he was 15 or 16 years old, his father, the Chafetz Chaim, sat him down to tell him exactly what he needed to know about human relationships. And I figure if it's good enough for the Chafetz Chaim, it's probably good enough for the rest of us. So my question is, why do parents hesitate? Why is it so difficult to talk about sexual issues? And I think there are a number of reasons. Some of them are sociological in nature, and some of them are personal. I'd like to take a look with you at some of the sociological issues which have confronted us over the course of the last generation or two. And particularly, we're going to start by looking at the decade of the 60s. Three things happened during that decade which really gave direction to the way in which humanity, at least in the Western world, conceptualizes human sexuality. The first one was in 1961. In 1961, the Searle Company marketed for the first time oral contraceptives, the pill. The technology for using hormones to prevent pregnancy had been known at least 50 years earlier, been developed by scientists in Germany. But what the Searle Company was able to do is produce this in a manner that made it available as a marketable commodity. Now, certainly from the perspective of the feminist world, this gave women a sense of better control over their own lives. And that is not to be in any way diminished as a significant factor in the history of human sexuality. But from those of us who are in the sexual health world, our consideration is perhaps equally valid, which is, for the first time in history, there was an almost 100% guaranteed differentiation between sex for the purpose of procreation and sex for the purpose of pleasure, which is no longer did people need to be concerned when they wanted to have a sexual relationship with their partner with regard to an unwanted pregnancy, a possible abortion, any kind of other complication which may result, any kind of hesitation. Now, for the first time, if people use the pill in accordance with the directions, better than 99% of the time they can be assured that their sexual adventure could be purely for the sake of pleasure. And that was in 1961. In 1965, there was a court case from the Supreme Court of the United States called Griswold versus Connecticut. There had been many states in America, perhaps most states at that time, who felt that they could legally determine whether or not a couple could use birth control. Not even to determine what kind of birth control, but whether they could use birth control at all. And Connecticut, even though it was an East Coast liberal state, did have, in fact, that law as part of its books. In 1965, the Supreme Court of the United States, based on a case taken by Griswold, determined that states, in fact, had no right to interfere with the sex lives of two consenting adults, meaning not only could states not determine what kind of prevention couples could use, they had no right to interfere with anything at all with regard to the couple's ability to enjoy their sex life together, assuming both people were consenting. The final aspects, the final event that occurred was at the end of the 1960s, and that was the famous rock concert at Woodstock. Now, that didn't necessarily mean in and of itself that there was anything that was happening sexual that wasn't happening before, but it did signify, for the first time, I think, in a very public way, a disconnect between the institutions of society, like religion, like family, like the law on the one hand, and the way people wanted to conduct themselves sexually on the other hand. In other words, from now on, whatever people wanted to do, they should be able to do, and no authority, no source of any kind of wisdom should be able to tell them how they should conduct themselves or not. So we find ourselves now, after the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and in our century, still sometimes struggling with a lack of certainty that did exist prior to those times. Sexuality now is very much in flux, very much open to all kinds of influences that may come from a variety of sources, and there is no authority figure to tell us what might be right, what might be wrong, what might be appropriate, what might be inappropriate. Beyond that, we also have a time in which we live in that's called non-binary sexuality, meaning the notions of there are two genders, men and women, and each conducts themselves in a certain way with regard to their sexuality. That essentially no longer exists. We have a wide spectrum of different kinds of gender identities, and because of the fact that we live in a time when minorities are considered to be the beneficiaries of the full rights of majority populations, particularly in democratic countries, even gender minorities are considered to be those who can benefit from full rights. In other words, it doesn't matter how you see yourself, it doesn't matter what your body looks like, it doesn't matter where you're a man on the way to being a woman or a woman on the way to being a man or someplace in between. You have the rights to determine who you are and to conduct yourself accordingly. And that also somehow gives us, those of us particularly who are not necessarily engaged in that kind of transient behavior, gives us sometimes a sense of being ill at ease. I'm not sure what's right and what's wrong, what's true and what's not true. And that also makes it somewhat difficult then to talk to our children because of our own sense of lack of assuredness of what human sexuality is all about. And finally, the other influence which essentially never existed before and existed now is the media. You know, when I first became involved in sexual health issues almost 50 years ago, the mantra was that there is nothing new under the sun. Well, that mantra no longer exists. And the fact that we find all aspects of human sexuality portrayed in the media, and here I am not necessarily talking about pornography. If we have a few minutes at the end of this discussion to relate to pornography, we will try to do so. But I'm talking about the fact that wherever you look, in any newspaper, on any television show, the portrayals of sexuality are more and more available, more and more open, more and more giving us messages of there is nothing that's improper, everything is okay, and people are entitled to live the lives that they want to live. I mean, one only needs to look at, for example, I always use this, lingerie ads in the New York Times to see that what is acceptable today might have been considered to be softcore pornography 40 years ago. And that is a world that we live in as well. All of that making it highly difficult for us to know exactly what can we tell our children, and from the perspective of our children, can they trust us? Can they believe that we live in the world that they live in, accept the kinds of change that they assume to be only natural, or are we stuck someplace way back in our history? But beyond that, there are also personal issues which make it difficult for we as parents to speak to our children about human sexuality, and that is our own personal conflicts, our own personal levels of unhappiness. Whatever the statistics may be about how many people are comfortable with their own sexuality or not, the fact is that enough of us do have issues that come up along the course of our lifetime that make it difficult for us to be able to speak to others about a topic in which we are not entirely certain in and of ourselves. We are confronted by conflicts that arose in our own past, which we have not resolved, by issues which arise between any two people who are trying to pull together a sex life when each of them comes from a very different place. And in that context, trying to talk with our children makes it much more difficult. And finally, we are often afraid of the question, meaning when we begin to talk to our sexuality about our children, are we afraid that they are going to ask us about our own sexuality? Well, let me guarantee you that 99% of all the children around have absolutely no interest in what their parents are doing in bed. The thought that even the notion that their parents are sexual, or that perhaps even at one time their grandparents were sexual, is enough to drive them into another room entirely. So being afraid of that question really doesn't give us an excuse for raising sexual issues with our children. But because of all this hesitancy, we have a tendency to look towards others as sources of sex education. We look towards school-based programs, and I don't know what happens here in South Africa. I can speak for what happens in the United States and Israel. Most of those school-based programs tend to be very technical, tend to be very negative. This is what you should not do. This is how you should not behave. What we don't have are programs that tell us about the beauty of sexuality, the pleasure of a mutual relationship, the notion of connecting in a way that's not just physical, but again is spiritual, is psychological, is emotional. No one talks about those in any of those programs. And I remember growing up that frequently those programs were placed in the hands of the physical ed teachers. Why they seem to be more expert about human sexuality, I really have absolutely no idea. And what we have today is premarital teachers for young grooms, young brides, primarily in the religious world, who are supposed to give these people some essential information before they get married, whether or not they have some of that information. Now, the truth is that these kinds of courses usually take place relatively soon before the wedding, at which time the brides and grooms tend to be worried about many other things in their lives and not necessarily focused on what their lives are going to be like as sexual beings with the so-called rights that the standing under the chuppah gives them. This whole construct of people who are giving guidance before marriage for brides and grooms is a new construct. We don't know if it's successful. We don't know if it's actually going to resolve the situation. But I will tell you that for the majority of us who are sexual health professionals, we find this to be too little, too late, and does not in any way answer the question. Which really brings us back to the primary issue that I need to focus on, which is what is the responsibility that parents have with regard to their children? The problem is that we abrogate our responsibility as parents. We don't talk to our children, and we assume that other people will fulfill that responsibility. We look to educational-based programs, to premarital counselors, and we find at the end that our children end up being confused, poorly educated, and perhaps even worse, have no one to speak to at a time in their lives when they desperately need to speak to someone. So what I'd like to do with you now is go through some guidelines that may be of assistance when you do speak to your children. Again, our focus here is not if you will speak to them, but when you will speak to them, okay? So first of all, know yourself. You need to clarify your own values and expectations. It's not at all unusual that people never think about what their own sexual values are. Their sexual expectations may be related simply to the relationship in which they are, not necessarily in a way that they want to raise their children. Having a conversation about this with your spouse is great for being able to say, well, this is the information we'd like to impart to our children. And again, we must keep in mind that we as responsible parents do in fact take seriously raising our children in just about every area of their life. And that includes all kinds of values with regard to how they should conduct each other. This should be part of our responsibility towards them as parents, as we being parents, and as them as well. Stay away from generalizations, okay? There's no such thing as all men or all women. We like to look at that. It makes our lives easier. But the point is that each man and each woman is individual. Each person will have her or his own way of looking at the world, his or her own history, her or his own sense of culture and values. And it's important that we raise our children with a sensitivity to look at each individual simply as an individual, to be valued as an individual. Our being able to talk about this topic of sexuality creates an atmosphere of openness and acceptance, meaning you can talk to me about anything. You can ask me anything. There is nothing you will say to me that is going to make me get up, run out of the room, faint, or love you any less. And not only can you talk to me about that now, but because we've been able to initiate this kind of dialogue, you'll be able to talk to me about that in the future as well, when issues, in fact, may be more complex, may be more difficult for you to deal with this. Sexuality is broader than just sex. Sexuality includes a sense of how we see ourselves, how the world sees us, male or female, and what our gender identity is. In other words, our sexuality encompasses the totality of our lives. It's not just sexual organs, it's not just sexual relations. It's the fact that we as men, we as women, we as something that may be in between, we project a message to the world and we respond to that world. And it is critical that we are able to talk with our children about that kind of interaction that we will have with the world now and as they mature in their lives. Next, we are all sexual beings from birth to death. That means that even during pregnancy, right, male embryo will be able to have an erection simply because of the impact of hormones on that very small penis. We are sexual all the time. We are never not sexual. How that becomes manifest, that depends on what society allows us, what our families allow us, and how comfortable we are with ourselves. But this notion of this is the way we were born, that we are hardwired to be sexual, ends up being an essential aspect of how we formulate our identities. Parents need to help adolescents, children define limits. They must be able to counter misinformation and unhealthy messages. Sexuality is about whole people. It's about their intimate physical relationships and not merely about body parts. If we are silent, if we are unclear about this, our children will not develop the values that they need to make healthy decisions. And even more important than that, parents must stop talking in code. Language needs to be accurate. It needs to be precise. We need to use descriptive terms that are clear to our children. We need to talk about facts that are clear to our children, and we need to give them guidance. It's not easy to find a comfortable language. And sometimes I will counsel parents that if they can't say words like penis and vagina, they need to talk to each other about that as parents before they talk to their children, because their children have already used language which is going to be much more descriptive than that. We need to be able to convey values and judgments, and those are conveyed by the language that we use. And let me give you a couple examples of that. You know, we assume sometimes that adolescents will do a certain amount of sexual experimentation. But whether we use the term experimentation or we use the term promiscuity gives very different values descriptions to those terms, gives very different messages to how we see our children. And our care in using such language can be a lesson that a child will have for a lifetime. And let me give you one other example of that. This is one I use with my students all the time. People talk about sexual needs, okay? Well, let me tell you that there are no sexual needs. Needs is a term that refers to things like air, like food, like water. We need to breathe. We need to eat. We need to drink, all right? There is no concept of sexual needs that is the same or parallel to those kinds of needs. The appropriate term is desires. And because the word desires is much more accurate, it means that desires are aspects of our lives that are under our control. We are not controlled by them, right? We are controlled by the need to breathe. We are controlled by the need to eat. If we talk about sexual desires, it means that we have a certain amount of flexibility in how we relate to how we feel about a sexual moment. It also means that there is no one else who's required to fulfill that desire for me. If I am in a dangerous situation and cannot breathe, I will assume that some other person may have the responsibility to assist me in my breathing. If I am not able to have a sexual satisfactory moment, it is not necessarily true that someone else has a requirement to fulfill that desire. Allowing children to grow with that kind of clarity of language resolves many dilemmas that they may encounter in their future. Parents need to define and set adequate limits for their children, right? Anyone who's raised an adolescent knows that adolescents bounce off limits, right? They may not always accept our limits. They may not always feel comfortable with them. But our responsibility is to set sexual limits for our children as we set limits in every other aspect of our lives. Sometimes we may set limits that are somewhat stricter than necessary so that our adolescents can have a certain amount of flexibility. But nevertheless, it is important that both parents are in agreement on what the sexual limits are with regard to appropriate behaviors that their children will be part of as they move on in their lives. Sex is much more than intercourse, and I think that's also a critical issue here. Most people think sexual intercourse when they hear the word sex, but sex is about intimacy and emotional closeness. Many young people do not understand this. One really critical example of this is this. Any place you have skin on your body, you have nerve endings. And wherever you have nerve endings, you can have a sensual experience with someone, whether it's a sexual organ or a cheek or the bottom of your foot or the top of your head. I had a man who once told me that he thought his wife's body, was like Disneyland, because anywhere he went, there was something that was fun. I think we need to begin to expand sexuality just from the intercourse between a penis and a vagina and move beyond that to including the entire body, head to toe, with the potential for people to enjoying the closeness, the intimacy that they may have with each other. All sexual behaviors are somewhat on an intimacy continuum. One end of physical closeness can be touching something like a face or hands, and another end could be touching genital organs. And there is a parallel with regard to emotions as well. Sometimes informations that we share with each other can be things like our favorite hobbies or our favorite sports teams. And sometimes intimacy can include sharing trust that allows us to impart information to another person that we may not feel trustworthy with anyone else on the planet. Children need to know what should be in place in a relationship before they become sexually involved with another person. And whether or not one looks through this through the glasses of a religiously observant person or using other kinds of values, it is critically important that we communicate what would make it safe and appropriate. Religiously, physically, emotionally, socially, before we tell our children that they may feel comfortable engaging in some kind of sexual relationship. And it will happen at times that your children will refuse to talk to you about this. They just don't want to hear it. You're not the person that they see as an authority figure. Please do not give up. The message to them is, it's my job and it's important to me that I share this information with you. We don't have to discuss it now, but you really need to listen, okay? The fact is that young people get too little sex education, too little guidance, and they get it too late, and often what they get is harmful information. They hear myths, they hear double standards, they don't hear enough about men being sensitive to women and women being sensitive to men. They don't hear enough about the differences between genders. They don't hear enough about how a family background can influence a person's perceptions of their own sexuality. And of course, young people rarely talk with each other when they have been the victim of childhood sexual abuse. We are our children's cultural interpreters. The fact is that the bad news is that sex is everywhere, in the media, in everywhere we look. But the good news is that sex is everywhere, and we have endless opportunities to openly discuss sexuality with our children. So this is the message. You have a responsibility as parents to raise your children to be healthy sexual beings. No one else is going to do this as well as you do. No one else is going to know your children as well as you know them. No one else is going to inculcate them with the values that you think are so critical with regard to being sexually healthy human beings. I'm going to end this now just with a couple words about pornography. The truth is that pornography is a highly complex, very difficult topic. If at any point you would like to invite me back here to speak with you about pornography, I'd be happy to do so. But just a couple words of guidelines at this point. One is this: your child will see pornography somewhere. You will not prevent it. Let me give you an interesting historical insight about this. A number of years ago, when pornography initially began to appear on the internet, one of the most commonly looked at pornographic sites was whitehouse.com. It was a pornography site. Well, before parents discovered this, thousands of children who were given assignments to do some kind of research on the White House in Washington, D.C., got a very different kind of education, okay? If you want to know about the White House, it's whitehouse.gov, G-O-V. So be assured that even if you have a filter system on your computer, your friend's computer will not have, your child's friends will not have, and all other ways that they are able to interact with the electronic world will allow them to some point see pornography. Second, the first conversation that you have with your children about sex should not be because they saw a pornographic internet site. If that's true, then you better take off your parental guidelines. They should well know about sexuality before, by accident, they discover something on the internet. And finally, if your children are open enough with you to tell you that they have seen something that's pornographic on the internet, make sure you ask them exactly what they saw. That's going to be critical in terms of the way that you relate to them, how you help them understand what they saw, and most importantly, how to differentiate between fantasy and reality. Let me finish here with a quotation from a Jewish religious book which discusses how important, in fact, it is for parents and children to be able to discuss this matter with each other. This is from Sefer Kedusha, as quoted in Marital Intimacy by Rabbi Friedman. And he says as follows: There are young people who do not know how to observe the mitzvah of ona, the commandment of marital relations, because, to our great sorrow and distress, in our time, the inner bonds between father and son and mother and daughter have been sundered. Matters of intimacy and knowledge of the private matters that transpire between husband and wife in previous generations were transmitted from father to son and from mother to daughter with love. My blessing to you is that you feel comfortable enough to transmit sexual information, all matters of intimacy, to your sons and to your daughters with love, and that may this conversation between us now allow you to begin to feel much more comfortable in raising this so critical issue with those who are going to be coming after us. I thank you all for your patience and listening to me from this hospital bed. I thank all of you who are involved from the office of the chief rabbi and all of those with whom he was involved in making this experience as positive as it could possibly be. And I look forward to seeing you again at some more fortunate time in the future.